If you grow up in a town like mine, your life is a map drawn with thick pencil. It's the kind of map where Main Street ends at the river, where the VFW hall sits across from the diner that still serves meatloaf on Tuesdays, where the grocery store closes early on Sundays, and the local paper prints wedding announcements and bowling scores with equal pride. My map had a route, a porch swing or two, a church potluck schedule, and a mailbox on nearly every stop. I walked the same streets for decades, watched maple leaves flare and fall, learned which dogs could be talked down with a biscuit and which ones required a respectful detour. And I carried people's lives in my satchel, birth announcements, sympathy cards, tax notices, catalogs for sweaters, and all the handwritten notes we pretend have gone out of style but never quite do. I did my work in a uniform and a cap, in snow and in sweat, with a kind of steady care that felt like a prayer without words. And in my chest, under those layers of order and routine, something kept knocking for a very long time. I didn't answer. It didn't stop. When I was a boy, I would have called it a peculiar restlessness. When I was a young man, I would have called it a problem to solve. When I married, I would have called it a draft coming from a window I couldn't find. When I got older, I started calling it what it was: love, wanting someplace to live. The first time I knew that love could arrive in a shape I wasn't supposed to admit, I was 15 in a library that smelled like dust, lemon oil, and pencil shavings. We sat at a shared table and his leg bumped mine under the wood. Innocent as rain, simple as a heartbeat, and somehow for me a bell ringing over a quiet field. He was a boy in a ball cap with a tooth that overlapped just a little, a freckle on his neck, and a laugh that made me feel like something good had picked me out on purpose. His name was Jack. We were lab partners and we were kids, and we were nowhere near a world that would let me say what that bell was called. So I put the sound in my pocket and told myself it was weather, passing through. I did what the map said next. I graduated. I found my way to a steady job at the post office, started at the counter, and then took a route. My father, a mechanic and a veteran, shook my hand without sentiment, which in his language was a kind of tenderness, and said, "Keep your feet under you, son." My mother, who worked in the school cafeteria and wore her hair in a short practical style that made her look ready for anything, tucked an extra sandwich into my bag the first week. I learned the art of a pace that keeps you warm without sweating, that conserves energy in August and finds courage in February. I learned handwriting, how it tells you who slants right and who decorates the letter I with a circle as if the world were friendlier than it sometimes is. I did not set out to hide. I set out to belong. Those are different goals, but it took me many years to see that one can swallow the other whole if you're not careful. Belonging in my town meant holding doors and saving your opinions for after the service. It meant mowing your lawn before the grass got too bold, returning pie plates, nodding to your neighbor, and not making a spectacle of yourself. It didn't leave much room for a kind of truth we didn't talk about. So I folded mine small as a stamp and told myself that silence could be a kind of faithfulness. I met Marion on a day that smelled like hot paper and machine oil. I was 27. She came into the post office with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She had a kind of neatness that made you want to stand up straighter. Pressed blouse, sensible shoes, a clear way of speaking that made long lines move faster because people felt they didn't have to perform confusion for her to be kind. She worked over at the county clerk's office and wore small gold studs in her ears. The sort of jewelry that says, "I'm not here for show, but I remember the details." She smiled at me, and something warmer than the overhead fluorescent light hummed in my chest. The letter that asked me to dinner arrived 2 days later, in a blue envelope with looping handwriting. She could have asked me at the counter, but she said later that a written note felt suited to a mail carrier, and anyway, she liked the way ink looks when it dries. We went to dinner at the Wren, which had checkered tablecloths and a chalkboard menu, and she ordered a pot pie with a salad and talked about the way she loved election days, the hum of civic duty, the "I voted" stickers like small flags on sweaters. I told her about my route and the way kids used to hang from the monkey bars and yell, "Mailman!" like a greeting they had invented and owned. We married that fall. The maples turned to fire and then let go one leaf at a time as if pacing themselves for our sakes. The pastor at our church, a gentleman with a soft voice and a habit of pressing his lips together whenever he said, "and so," pronounced the words we all recognized, forsaking all others, in sickness and in health. And we walked down an aisle scattered with red leaves a toddler had smuggled in, too charming to scold. My father wore a suit that fit almost right. My mother cried into a handkerchief she'd ironed that morning. Marion slid her hand into mine like someone who knows what she's doing. We made a home that smelled like lemon oil and laundry soap, that had a stack of library books by the chair and recipes clipped from the paper stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like an ear of corn. We had a daughter, Ellie, who arrived with my eyes and her mother's determined mouth and grew up sure-footed and tender-hearted, the kind of kid who lined up her stuffed animals to take their temperatures and never forgot to write thank-you notes. The years unspooled cleanly, one after another. School plays, 4th of July parades, the ritual of putting away the garden hose before the first frost, the comfort of the same pew every Sunday. We were good to each other in the ways we knew how to be good, and yet I carried a folded thing in my pocket. Even when I was laughing, even when I was fixing a leaky faucet, even when I was awed by Ellie sleeping on my chest when she was small, her breath a soft metronome. The folded thing wasn't a betrayal of the life we built. It was a longing I didn't have language for, a color I knew but never named. I did what so many of us do. I made the best garden I could with the seeds I could admit to. I am not ashamed of that. But I can't tell you the truth of what ended without telling you the truth of what I carried. 21 years is a long time in any arithmetic. We tried hard, and when trying wasn't enough, we tried again, and after that, we tried counseling, and after that, we tried going to church more, and after that, we tried speaking less in case words were what was making the tenderness thin. One day, we were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, hands folded as if there were a teacher at the front of the room waiting to call on us, and we both knew that kindness would be the same old kindness whether we continued or not, and that something in me and in her had turned a corner we couldn't undo. We signed papers like people who respected paper. We placed our rings in small dishes. She kept the house. I rented a modest place near a walking trail and a library in a neighboring town that felt similar enough to be a cousin. I bought a pothos plant because the man at the hardware store said, "You can't kill this one," sounding more hopeful than certain. I put the plant on the kitchen sill and watched its leaves learn which way the light came in. I started going to the library in the evenings, walking the few blocks past the barber shop and the music store that mostly sold guitar strings and harmonicas. The library had a copper weather vane on the roof, a fox, and the reading room had wooden rods for the newspapers, brass-tipped, a detail I appreciated for reasons I couldn't have told you. I began to understand that you can feel lonelier in a house full of people than you do in a quiet room with strangers who love to read. That's where I first saw him. Daniel. At first, he was just a presence. Someone who turned pages slowly, who listened harder than he talked, who had a streak of silver in his hair and forearms that looked like he had done real work without making a philosophy out of it. He wore button-down shirts with sleeves rolled the way teachers do when the day is hot and the subject is worth focusing on anyway. He had a careful face when he was not smiling and a beautifully uncareful one when he did. He handed me a magazine once as if he were passing a cup of water to someone who'd been out in the sun too long. "Here," he said, eyes already returning to his book. "You can tell a lot about a person by how they say here." The next time we spoke, it was about the Reds. He said, "They'll break your heart and then buy you a hot dog," which made me laugh because in my life that had been true more years than not. Then we talked about a piece in the paper on monarch butterflies, and he said he'd planted milkweed out back even though he didn't like how wild it looked, because it felt right to make room for travelers. I told him about my route and how you can tell when a neighborhood is sad by how the trash cans linger at the curb. He nodded like a person who has seen sadness and doesn't mind if you admit it exists. His kindness was small-scale and constant. He folded his leftover muffin into a napkin and handed it to a man who looked like his day had been longer than the clock could account for. He returned a book for an older woman who forgot she had double knee replacements and couldn't drive in the rain, and wrote the librarian a note to explain so the woman wouldn't be fined. He moved through the world as if it were a place where attention was the currency that guaranteed everyone got home. We started walking together. Not on purpose, not like dates, just steps matched for a block or two, the way you do when you discover your pace makes sense next to someone else's. He was a retired teacher. Taught American history for 33 years and didn't mind repeating himself when a kid needed the second chance. Loved field trips to the State House, loved the way 8th graders pretend to know more than they do, loved how they tell you the truth when they forget they're supposed to be cool. He had a brother in Seattle, a place he had visited once and where it rained in a way that made him think of the word rinse. He'd never married. Said it matter-of-factly, like a weather report. No shame, no emphasis. I told him about Marion, how we were good to each other, how we ended our marriage kindly, and how our daughter, grown now, lived across town and checked in on me more than I deserved. Rain came one afternoon like a curtain dropping. We were both caught without umbrellas. I ducked under the overhang of his apartment building, shoes squeaking on the mat. He went upstairs and came back with a towel that smelled like laundry detergent and a gray sweater that looked like the kind of garment that doesn't pretend to be anything it isn't. No sense catching a cold, he said. I pulled on the sweater and felt something in me breathe in a way I had not let it breathe since I was a boy in a library. We stood there, listening to the rain on the awning. The sound of traffic softened, the world snugged down to a manageable size. And I thought, I am in trouble, and I am lucky, and I am 60 now. And life is still brave enough to try. When you've hidden for as long as I did, your body will tell the truth before your mouth does. Mine did in a grocery aisle by the T. We were debating brands when a neighbor from the post office, friendly, newsy, rolled up her cart. Well, look who it is, she said to me. Then, turning, and who's your friend? The word friend has been asked in 100 tones. This one was curious, not cruel. But the weight of it, the history packed into those 6 letters, pressed on my chest. This is Daniel, I said. We met at the library. True, but insufficient. She chatted the way people do, asked about my retirement date, said something about her nephew coming back from basic training, then moved along, her cart squeaking. Daniel looked at me. We okay? He asked softly. The question a hand extended but not insistent. Yes, I said, though what I meant was I am slow, but I am moving. We have time, he said. And those 3 words landed in my bones in a way that felt like medicine I'd been prescribed years ago and was finally remembering to take. Silence has a cost, and it collects interest. It charged me sleep. It charged me ease. It charged me the small joy of putting my hand on the back of the man I loved while we waited in line for coffee. It charged me the ability to say 3 simple words, this is mine, without my throat closing up as if I'd swallowed a stone. I told myself dignity required privacy, but the truth was, I was scared of a world that, in my memory, still cracked its knuckles when 2 men stood too close. I was scared of the boy I had been, who had learned early to sit on his hands and keep his laugh down. What changed the pace wasn't a plan. It was a pinch under my left collarbone while I was putting away groceries on a sky-blue October afternoon. The ache wasn't dramatic. It was insistent. My arms got heavy the way they do when you've carried too much in from the car at once. I sat down, told myself it would pass, waited, remembered every poster about heart attack symptoms I'd ever read in the break room, and then I called Ellie. Dad, she said, calm like only a nurse can be. I love you, hang up. Dial 911. I'm on my way. At the hospital, the world became light and beeps and wheels and efficiency. A nurse with eyes like a story you want to hear all the way through took my information, and Daniel, who had followed the ambulance in his car, hovered at the door, his whole body asking permission to be near. The nurse glanced at him, then at me. Is he family? She asked, the question mercifully unadorned. In the old days, a question like that would have sent me underground. That day, something steady stood up inside me and spoke with my mouth. He's my partner, I said. I didn't say it loudly, but it echoed anyway inside me over the years I had let pass. The nurse nodded, wrote it down, pulled up a chair for him, and said, "You can sit here." Daniel's face did a thing I don't have a simple word for. It loosened and crumpled and brightened all at once. He took my hand. He said nothing at first, which is my favorite way to be loved. Held company, not a performance. It wasn't a heart attack, they told me. It was a warning. Blood pressure up, stress carving its name where it had no business. Rest, they said, and change what you can. I nodded like I was in church, and in some ways I was. They sent me home with a packet and a monitor. Daniel dropped me at my place, made soup in a pot that had belonged to my mother, set the bowl down in front of me like a miracle, and stayed until the kitchen clock told us it was late and he should go. "We have time," he said again at the door. "Let's not waste it," I answered, a new sentence trying its legs. The next Sunday, I set out the good napkins, the ones with stitched edges that make even chicken salad feel elevated, and I asked Ellie to come by for lunch. She took off her shoes at the door and hugged me as if I were both breakable and indestructible, which I suppose I am. Daniel offered to take a walk so I could speak privately. I told him to stay because the difference between secrecy and privacy is who you trust to sit at your table. "There's something I want to say," I began, my voice doing the tremble my father's used to do when he caught a cold. "Daniel is my partner. That's who he is to me." Ellie stared at me for one long heartbeat, and then she covered her mouth and laughed and started to cry at the same time. "Finally," she said, "Dad, I've been waiting for you to be as kind to yourself as you are to everyone else." She kissed the top of my head, walked around the table, shook Daniel's hand like you do when you know you're shaking something important, and said, "I'm glad you're here. Do you like baseball? Because he will make you watch the Reds. I'm warning you now." We laughed, and it sounded like a porch swing settling into a rhythm. We made a plan, how to tell the rest of the family, what words we'd use with the world so that no one had to guess or gossip for sport, what to do when someone needed a minute to catch up. I called Marion because there are conversations you have in person or not at all. We met at the Wren, where the chalkboard menu had changed, but the coffee was the same honest brew it's always been. She wore a scarf with small flowers on it and listened the way she always has. Leaned in, set her cup down deliberately, eyes steady. I told her about Daniel, about the hospital, about the way it felt to say partner out loud and feel the architecture of my life shift into a shape that made sense. I told her I was sorry for any part of our ache that had been born from my silence. She placed her hand on mine and said, "I wondered." Not an accusation. A gift. She asked to meet him. She said she was happy for me. She asked practical questions about holidays because she has never been a woman who lets love float without a plate to land on. When Daniel and Marion shook hands in the library reading room 2 weeks later, it felt like the world had decided to be a little kinder than it used to be. She thanked him for taking care of me when I had my scare. He thanked her for the years we shared and for Ellie, who is, we all agree, the best of us. No lightning struck. The floor didn't open. We stood there in the smell of books and old wood and watched decency do its steady, quiet work. Church had to know eventually. The people there had taught me my first hymns and how to pass the plate without dropping it and how to stack chairs after a potluck so the floor could be swept. My small group met on Wednesdays in the fellowship hall, where the coffee is always a touch stronger than necessary and somebody inevitably brings a pie that will be gone within 15 minutes of the prayer. I told them, "This is Daniel. I love him. I said it the way you say grace. Simple, grateful, and with the knowledge there's more to come." Carol, who knows everyone's birthday and has yet to meet a condolence card she didn't send, squeezed my hand. Frank, who reads the scripture and once installed my storm windows without letting me pay him, cleared his throat and said, "Well, does he like potato salad?" One man avoided my eyes and left early. That stung. But kindness can be louder than avoidance when a room decides it will be, and that night, it was. At the potluck that Sunday, a woman I knew by sight more than name came up and said, "Heard you like lemon bars." I nodded, surprised. She grinned and pointed to 2 plates, one with regular flour, one labeled gluten-free with a little index card, and a heart drawn on it because her grandson can't have wheat. "Tell Daniel he's got his own plate," she said. There are many ways a country expresses itself. Cornfields at dusk, fireworks on the 4th, lemon bars with your name on them. My last day in uniform at the post office came not long after. We held the retirement party in the sorting room by the rolling carts and the bundles of rubber bands that always managed to escape every drawer. There was a sheet cake decorated with a flag because humor at the post office is a steady thing you can count on. Someone made chili. Ellie arrived with balloons that bounced against the ceiling. Marion brought a crock pot and set it near the outlet that doesn't short. Daniel stood beside me, and people said hello to him in that careful way. People in small towns say hello. When they are adjusting to a new word they know is going to be part of their sentences from now on. Some folks hugged us both. Some nodded. One man patted my shoulder and said, "Happy for you," as if we were discussing a successful fishing trip. It meant more than he knew. Then Wayne, my supervisor, a man who has walked like he's got 2 more things to do than any day allows, clapped his hands. "Hold up," he said, voice carrying, authority made gentle by the occasion. He pulled a white envelope from his breast pocket. "Your father brought this to me months ago," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. "Told me to hand it over on your last day. Told me if I didn't, he'd haunt me. Figured I ought to listen." The room tilted. My father had died quietly the previous spring, the way he lived, without asking a fuss. I took the envelope with my name in his blocky handwriting, the letters practical, unornamented, the way he was. The letter was 1 page, folded once. I unfolded it as if it might bite, as if it might bless. "Son, I fixed a lot of things for a living. Writing to tell you there's nothing about you that needs fixing. I did not know how to say this sooner. I know how now. A father knows his boy's eyes. You were a good son in a quiet house. I saw the trying. A good life doesn't have to be quiet to be true. If you love a man, bring him by. I'd like to shake his hand. I hope you get coffee with someone who looks at you like your mother looked at me in the mornings we remembered to be good to each other. Tell the truth even if your voice sounds like mine when I had the flu. It gets steadier. Take care of your knees. Let folks bring you food when you're sick. Don't walk away from your own table. I'm proud of you. Be happy if you can. Dad." I read it twice without knowing I'd read it at all. The room became the kind of quiet where you can hear the hum of the soda machine. Ellie pressed her head to my shoulder. Marion's hand found my sleeve. Daniel stood beside me like a porch post. Wayne sniffed and said, "All right, Cake," because sometimes you save the room by moving forward into sweetness. I slid the letter back into the envelope and then into my shirt pocket, close to where the ache had been, a new sort of weight. The shock of how my hiding ended wasn't fireworks. It was the long, slow surprise of a life that didn't punish me the way I had been punishing myself. It was a nurse's question answered honestly. It was a daughter who said finally and meant it like an invitation. It was an ex-wife who kept her kindness in stock and sold it wholesale. It was a town that chose casseroles and lemon bars, a supervisor who handed me my father's words, and that father who had found language at the end he did not have at the beginning. It was Daniel, steady, patient, the hum at my shoulder finally allowed to be music. We got married in the courthouse with the same clerk who had notarized my request to stop delivery when I'd taken a vacation the year before. She smiled like someone who knows the importance of documents. The judge had a coffee stain on his sleeve and a voice that made the vows sound like the good, sturdy things they are. Ellie walked me in, her arm through mine, eyes bright, grin big enough to light the aisle. Marion sat in the front row, a floral dress and a small smile, and pressed a linen handkerchief into Daniel's palm because she'd found it at a second-hand shop, and the letter D stitched in the corner made her think of him. We said the simple words. We meant them. We signed the book the judge kept, our names in ink, and a bus driver passing outside honked once, the sound coming through the open window like a blessing from a stranger. People clapped. We laughed. It was enough. We hosted cake and sandwiches in the fellowship hall, a grocery store sheet cake with our names spelled right, a plate of lemon bars that disappeared half too soon, a karaoke machine someone dragged in for comedy. Ellie sang a Carpenter's song and made Daniel cry in a way only joy can. The pastor shook Daniel's hand and told him that most of love's miracles look like taking out the trash without being asked. Folks signed a card and whispered their own news in our ears because weddings do that, make people feel like their little courage might be worth speaking into the air. The days after were not a parade. They were better. They were ordinary in a way I hadn't known to wish for. 2 mugs on the counter, 2 pairs of shoes by the door, one always somehow a little muddier than the other. Daniel says it's the history teacher in him, always stepping off the path to look at a plaque. A plant on the sill that kept growing because nobody told it to stop. The middle of the night check when one of us got up and the other listened for a toilet flush or a cough and relaxed when the other came back to bed. The argument about the dishwasher, he likes to run it half full because he claims the dishes are lonelier the second day. I like to pack it like a puzzle. We learned our way to apology, to the small middle ground of, you were right about the bowls, on the top rack, which is another way to say I love you, without pretending your way is the only intelligent way. We drove to Lake Erie one weekend, because the air felt like it wanted us to see water. We stopped for coffee at a place that wrote your name on the cup and spelled both of ours right, which felt like a good omen. We walked along a shore that looked like somebody had used a ruler on the horizon. We bought a kite shaped like a red swallow and let it tug out line until the string hummed. Daniel told me about the young teacher he'd been. Careful because the world was, about a principal who told him once, in a tone that pretended to be advice, to leave the personal at the personnel door, and how he had taken that suggestion so literally he almost walked out of himself some days. I told him about Jack, the boy with the freckle, and how sometimes the memory of that leg touching mine under the table felt like a letter addressed to the wrong person that somehow still found a home. Back home, we signed up to volunteer at the library, reshelving, reading with little kids once a month, getting the smug satisfaction of placing a book exactly where the number says it goes. Daniel started growing tomatoes in a raised bed out back. He put in milkweed, of course, and a bench that looks out over the alley where neighborhood kids ride their bikes on training wheels like brave astronauts. I refinished the porch swing, remembering my father's advice. Sand with the grain, take your time, don't overwork it. And we sat there on summer evenings with iced tea, our knees touching, the light soft on the edges of the houses, and I felt like the porch itself had taken a breath and widened to hold us. Small-town kindness kept coming in its strange, practical ways. The man at the hardware store, who used to make jokes I endured, stopped me by the screws and bolts and said, "Hey, I said some dumb things in my day. Glad you're happy." A neighbor who blows leaves at 7 a.m., a habit we do not love, brought over a pie and told us his grandson had come out last Christmas and how seeing us wave from the porch made conversations in his house easier. At the barber shop, the older men paused when I walked in, then one of them asked about my tomatoes like always, and we moved on. Not a parade. Enough. We had our first Thanksgiving with the new configuration. Ellie came with a sweet potato casserole and a mystery dip she did not name until we admitted it was delicious. Then she confessed it was ranch, which felt like a punchline from the Midwest itself. Marion and her husband brought rolls, soft as pillows, and a jar of homemade jam. I carved the turkey with my father's knife, the one he sharpened on a stone he kept in an old tobacco tin. We said grace. And I thanked the giver of good things for courage that shows up in kitchens and courthouses and hospital hallways. For daughters who say finally with joy. For ex-wives who bring roles and kindness in equal measure. For small towns that decide to widen rather than close. After dinner, we played cards, and Marion beat us all, as she always does. And Daniel laughed so hard at a joke Ellie told that he had to set his hand down on the table to steady himself. Winter set in, and with it the kind of quiet that invites you to listen to your house breathing. We learned each other's ghosts, the nights I would wake and walk the kitchen, counting the tiles like prayers, my hand on my chest out of habit as much as fear. The afternoons he would grow silent and need me to sit nearby without asking questions, his eyes somewhere far off where a younger man he'd been still needed someone wiser to say, "You get to be whole." We went to the doctor together, me for a follow-up on that warning in my chest, him for his own blood work, and we listed each other in the space-marked emergency contact without feeling the old rush of guilt that used to accompany that kind of truth. One morning, weeks after the wedding, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. I opened it with a flick born of muscle memory and 1 part anticipation, 1 part suspicion. Inside was a black and white photograph, creased, of my father as a young man in uniform, arm slung around another soldier near a jeep. The two of them stood so close, their shadows braided at the feet. On the back, in my father's handwriting, the one I would know among 1,000 samples, he had written, "Do not wait to stand beside the person who makes you laugh when you are tired." There was no explanation, no signature, just that line. The room changed shape around me. I set the photo on the table and felt like time had folded in a way that let a younger and an older version of the same man trade a message across a gap. I didn't show the picture to many people. I showed it to Daniel, and he touched the edge with 1 finger, the way you touch a relic, and nodded. I showed it to Ellie, who stared a long time and then said, "Grandpa always did like to stand close when he loved you," which is true and complicated and somehow exactly enough. I tried not to make a legend out of it. I tried to let it be what it was. A note from a man who learned more by the end than he could say at the beginning. A benediction folded into my mailbox by someone who must have known enough to send it. It didn't change the past. It blessed the present. In spring, the pothos plant had reached the corner of the window and was heading toward the cabinet like an explorer. We bought 2 more plants because I, a former skeptic, had become the sort of person who talks to greenery with a straight face. Daniel laughed at me and then did the same when he thought I wasn't listening. We took turns on Sunday afternoons reading the paper out loud. The stories about city council and minor league baseball and a human interest piece about a woman turning 100 who credited her longevity to crossword puzzles and saying what I mean. Sweetheart, we practiced that. 2, saying what we meant, not harshly, not endlessly, just enough to spare ourselves carrying the heavy things alone. I went back to visit my old roots sometimes, no mailbag now, just a walk. I still knew which porches needed repairs, which sidewalks tripped you up, which houses smelled like coffee even outside because someone kept their window open no matter the weather. I put my hand on the lids of certain mailboxes as I passed, the way a person touches a pew when they enter a sanctuary. Near the end of the route, there were the steps to the house where I'd once fallen and banged my knee. I didn't climb them. I waved at the window where an older man sat with his oxygen tank, and he waved back. I went home and made lunch for Daniel and me. Tuna sandwiches, chips, apple slices, and we ate at the table with the checkered cloth and both reached for the salt at the same time and smiled at the old domestic choreography we were learning. When I tell you my hiding ended shockingly, I don't mean the kind of shock that makes you drop a glass. I mean the kind that makes you put a glass down carefully and realize the table is steady enough to hold it. The shock was in discovering that the world, which I'd feared, was kinder than I'd given it credit for, or at least that my corner of it had a muscle for decency I hadn't asked it to use. The shock was the taste of relief, which is not bland, as I had expected, but bright, like the first strawberry of the season. The shock was that love in your 60s can make you feel like a boy in a library with a bell ringing under the table and your leg shaking only a little. The shock was that my father had known more than I knew he knew. The shock was not thunder. It was a nurse saying, "Is he family?" And me saying yes. If you're sitting at your own table right now, if your coffee has gone cold because you've been thinking about something you haven't said for years, if your hands are clean because you've washed them after filling the bird feeder and you're resting before making dinner, I want to tell you what I wish someone had told me. Your story does not expire. There is no time when love becomes against the law of your life. You can be 62 and still learn to say the word partner and not whisper. You can meet a kind man in a library after you've raised a daughter and retired and still feel like the universe tucked something under your pillow with your name on it. I'm not telling you to blow up your life. I'm telling you to set your table. Take out the good napkins. Light a candle if you've got one. Invite one person you trust and say one truer sentence than you said yesterday. Practice the sound of your own voice telling your own news. Then when a nurse asks in a fluorescent hallway, answer. When your daughter says finally, let her. When an old friend needs a minute, give it. When your church potluck serves lemon bars, take 2. When your neighbor who blows leaves too early in the morning brings a pie, accept it and let him tell you about his grandson. The other night, Daniel and I sat on the porch swing and listened to the crickets. A teenager rumbled past in a car that sounded like a lion and looked like a toaster, and we laughed. The porch light threw a soft circle on the steps. Ellie texted that she was headed home from the late shift and that she loved us, and we left the light on a little longer because it felt good to make a path visible. The pothos leaves brushed the window like a polite reminder to water, and a bat swooped in the streetlight, turning invisible and then visible again. Daniel leaned his head on my shoulder and said, "I never thought we'd get here." I said, "We did, though." We rocked, and the swing creaked in the way my father said a swing should, audible but not alarming. I have carried 100,000 letters. I have placed envelopes in boxes and slid newspapers into slots so people could eat their breakfast with the world's news under their fingers. The most important letter I ever delivered came late. It had my father's handwriting on the front, and words inside I had been waiting to hear since long before I knew how to ask for them. The second most important letter wasn't paper at all. It was a sentence I said in an emergency room when my life could have gone one way or the other, and I chose the one with light. "He's my partner," I said. That was the end of hiding and the beginning of so much else, a kitchen with 2 mugs, a life with 2 chairs, a town that held us more gently than I dared predict, a daughter who laughs when she says finally, because finally is the sound of love arriving exactly when it can. The camera fades back to these hands, which are mine, older now, lined from years of sorting and carrying, strong from the weight of bags and the weight of keeping quiet, steadier from the relief of telling the truth. If we were all in the same room, I'd pour you coffee and offer you lemon bars and a seat at this table. I'd ask you how your garden is doing. I'd tell you the pothos is thriving, that Lake Erie is still holding the horizon level, that the Reds will disappoint you and then give you a reason to hope, that people who didn't know they could be kind are practicing, that love got here and decided to stay. I would remind you to take your pills, with food, and to write down your questions for your doctor, and to wear comfortable shoes to the farmer's market because cucumbers look lighter than they are when the music swells and the screen goes black in a minute. The story doesn't end. I'll still get up tomorrow and check the weather and ask Daniel if he wants oatmeal or eggs, and he'll say yes like he always does because he likes to think of breakfast as a menu rather than a choice. We'll read the paper. We'll return our library books on time or a day late with an apology that the librarian accepts with a smile. We'll wave to the neighbor who blows leaves at an ungodly hour and thank him for the pie anyway. We'll pull a weed out of the tomatoes and loosen the soil around the milkweed to make room for the monarchs. We'll call Ellie. We'll check on Marion and her husband if the light is off at a time it's usually on. We'll wash the dishes. We'll go to bed. We'll sleep, which is its own kind of yes. What I've been hiding? It was never a scandal. It was never sin, though I let fear call it that once in a while. It was love, patient beyond reason, steady as a root, persistent as a plant that wants the light. How did it end? Shockingly, with a whisper and a sentence and a handful of hands. My daughters, my ex-wives, my supervisors, a nurse's, Daniel's placed on my shoulders or my sleeve, anchoring me to a world I had been walking through quietly for too long. The end of hiding looks like a beginning when you stand back far enough. It looks like a life arranged on purpose around the person who makes you laugh when you are tired. It looks like a porch light left on, not because anyone is lost, but because it's a pleasure to make the path home visible.